When Rome fell, the world did not end. It fractured, like glass struck by history's hammer. For centuries, Europe lay in ruins, kings without crowns, faith without unity, and people without a future. But then came a dynasty that dared to rebuild the West, not with marble, but with faith, learning, and iron. This is the story of how the Carolingians, led by one man, Charlemagne, resurrected the dream of Rome and forged the foundation of Europe as we know it. A world reborn from chaos, an empire built from brokenness. 1. The silence after Rome. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, it left behind more than empty cities. It left behind a vacuum of meaning. Roads crumbled, literacy vanished, trade retreated. The West became a scattered archipelago of kingdoms and tribes, speaking in tongues Rome could no longer recognize. Power fragmented into chaos. The Church, once a spiritual authority, became the only thread connecting these lands, the keeper of memory in an age without maps. But the dream of unity did not die. It merely slept. In the shadow of this broken world, a new power began to rise. Not Roman, not barbarian, but something in between. The Franks. 2. The rise of the Franks. Among the ruins of Gaul, the Franks carved their destiny through war and alliance. By the 8th century, they had replaced the fading line of the Merovingians with a new dynasty, pragmatic, pious, and ruthless. The Carolingians. They did not inherit empire. They built it, piece by piece, through diplomacy, faith, and the sword. Their first great architect was Charles Martel, the hammer. In 732, he halted the Muslim advance at the Battle of Tours, a victory that became legend. But more than a battlefield triumph, it was a signal. The West would not fall again. Martel's son, Pepin the Short, took the next step, seizing the throne with papal blessing, uniting divine authority with royal power. It was a pact that would define Europe for 1,000 years. Kings rule by the grace of God, and the Church blesses their reign. The fusion of altar and throne had begun. 3. Charlemagne, the architect of the West. Then came Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He inherited not just a kingdom, but a question. Could order rise again from the ashes of Rome? Charlemagne's answer was not words, but conquest. From the Pyrenees to the Danube, he forged unity through relentless campaigns, 20, then 30, then 40 years of war. But his empire was not just one of territory, it was one of imagination. He called himself not simply a king, but Rex Pater Europae, the father of Europe. He dreamed of a civilization rooted in learning, law, and faith, a new Rome sanctified by the cross. When the Pope crowned him Emperor of the Romans in the year 800, it was more than ceremony, it was resurrection. For the first time in centuries, Europe had an emperor again. The West was reborn. 4. The Empire of Mind. Yet Charlemagne understood that conquest alone could not hold an empire together. Swords rust, kingdoms fall, only ideas endure. So he built schools. He summoned scholars from across Christendom, from Ireland, Italy, and beyond, to his court at Aachen. There, under vaulted ceilings and candlelight, he birthed what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. It was a rebirth of learning, of Latin, grammar, law, theology, and art. Books were copied by hand, illuminated in monasteries by monks who saw themselves not as artists, but as keepers of civilization. This was the moment the West remembered how to think again. The flame of literacy, nearly extinguished, flickered back to life. Charlemagne's empire became not only the guardian of faith, but the guardian of knowledge. He understood that empire is not just territory, it is memory, written into parchment and prayer. Through learning, the Carolingians rebuilt the West's mind. 5. The power of faith. But Charlemagne's empire was also built on faith, and faith was power. He saw himself as God's instrument, chosen to bring order to a fallen world. The church blessed his crown. He, in turn, defended the church with the sword. Together, they created a sacred partnership, an empire where religion justified rule, and rule protected religion. He enforced unity not only of land, but of belief. Pagans were converted sometimes by choice, often by force. The Saxons resisted, and Charlemagne answered with fire and steel. To him, salvation and submission were the same. It is here that the illusion of perfection began to form, a vision of harmony masking the violence beneath it. The Carolingian world looked divine, but it was born of discipline, fear, and absolute order. And yet, this paradox would define Europe for centuries, that civilization often rises not from peace, but from the control of chaos. 6. The machinery of empire. Charlemagne ruled not from marble halls, but through a system of faith and function. He appointed missi dominici, royal agents who traveled his vast empire, carrying his laws and inspecting his nobles. They were his eyes and ears, ensuring that the emperor's word reached even the most distant village. He standardized laws, weights, and measures. He minted new coins bearing his image. He demanded loyalty from his nobles, but also service, tribute, and faith. His empire became a living network of relationships, fragile but revolutionary. For the first time since Rome, there was an attempt to govern the West as one coherent whole. It was not perfect, but it was enough to remind Europe what unity could look like. 7. The illusion of perfection. To the outside world, Charlemagne's empire seemed eternal. The church hailed him as a new Constantine. Scholars praised his wisdom. Poets called him the chosen of God. But beneath the surface, cracks formed. His empire was built on loyalty, not law, on personality, not permanence. When the man was gone, the machinery began to fail. After his death in 814, his heirs divided his lands. Brothers turned against brothers. The empire splintered into kingdoms: West Francia, East Francia, Italy. The illusion of unity dissolved into the chaos it was meant to defeat. And yet, even in its fall, the Carolingian Empire left behind something extraordinary: a template, a memory of what Europe could be when bound by common faith, language, and law. The illusion had failed, but the idea endured. 8. The legacy of the broken empire. In time, new powers would rise from its bones: France, Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. Each would claim descent from Charlemagne, the great unifier. His coronation became the seed of medieval Europe's political theology, that no ruler was truly sovereign without divine approval. His reforms in education and administration shaped the church and state alike for centuries, and his dream of a united Christendom lingered, haunting kings and emperors long after his empire had turned to dust. Even today, the European Union, born of treaties and trade, echoes the Carolingian vision of unity through order. The idea that Europe could rise again, rebuilt not by conquest, but by cooperation, owes its spiritual roots to a ruler who died more than a millennium ago. Charlemagne's empire was mortal. His myth was not. 9. The philosopher's mirror. When we look back at the Carolingian Empire, we see a paradox, a civilization reborn from faith and fear, intellect and war. It rebuilt the West, but it also redefined what the West meant. To rebuild, Charlemagne had to remember, and to remember, he had to invent. He borrowed the image of Rome, the structure of the church, the logic of law, and bound them together into something entirely new. In doing so, he created a mirror in which later generations would see both their glory and their guilt. For every reform, there was repression. For every school, a sword. But perhaps this is the true lesson of the Carolingians, that civilization is never clean, it is carved from contradiction. They rebuilt the West, not by erasing its ruins, but by building atop them, transforming fragments of the past into the foundation of the future. 10. The dream that never died. When Charlemagne was buried in his cathedral at Aachen, he was laid to rest in imperial robes, seated upon his throne, as though even death could not dethrone him. Around him, his empire fractured, but his legend grew. He became a saint, a symbol, a story, Europe's eternal emperor. His successors would invoke his name for centuries, from Otto the Great to Napoleon, each claiming to continue his work. And in a way, they did, because Charlemagne's true empire was not territory. It was an idea that from chaos, order could rise again, that learning could conquer ignorance, that faith could unite the world. The Carolingian Empire rebuilt the broken West, not through perfection, but through vision. The vision that even in ruin, greatness could be reborn. And perhaps that is why the story still matters today. Because every age, in its own way, must rebuild its own broken world and find its Charlemagne among the ashes. Conclusion. The Carolingian Empire was not Rome reborn. It was Europe imagined. A fragile, luminous dream, half faith, half force, that carried the West out of darkness and into history once more. Empires rise and fall, but the will to rebuild endures, and in that, the Carolingians live on, not as conquerors, but as architects of renewal. They took a broken world, and through vision, belief, and sheer will, made it whole again. And for a brief, shining moment, the West remembered what it meant to be civilized. If you found this story fascinating, like, share, and subscribe to Timeless Questions channel, where we explore the civilizations, ideas, and mysteries that shaped humanity.